Good evening. Nationwide tonight, the Christmas Island Casebook. Within the past hour, the Ministry of Defence has announced that it's to conduct a survey of the 15,000 people who took part in the British nuclear tests in the 1950s. Their aim, to discover whether their health has suffered as a result. Well, for the past month, Nationwide has been compiling a dossier on the men who took part in those early nuclear tests. Richard.
This is the Nationwide Casebook on the Christmas Island tests. It contains the letters that ex-servicemen and their relatives have written to us about their participation in the experiments held in the late 50s and their catalogue of death and illness since then. It makes grim reading. Widows and bereaved relatives have told us of deaths from leukemia and other cancers. And in a few minutes, a leading expert in cancer statistics will tell us that our casebook reveals a much greater incidence of blood cancers than one would expect to find in a normal sample of the population. But it also reveals a whole range of illnesses, many of which could be radiation-linked, various cancers, skin rashes, eye cataracts, and some other rare diseases. Now, it's been consistently maintained by the government over the past 25 years that there's no statistical evidence to link the Christmas Island tests with ill health. And the Ministry of Defence has emphasised again and again that the 9 nuclear tests held on or near Christmas Island in 1957 and 58 were as safe as they could possibly be.
There are two sorts of nuclear weapons bursts, air bursts and, as here, ground bursts. To put it simply, when a nuclear weapon is detonated at low level, it sucks up huge quantities of earth. This returns to the ground as radioactive fallout. It's highly lethal, although invisible, dust. That's the ground burst. Exposure to even small amounts can still have dreadful effects: leukemia, lymphatic cancers, and sterility. It's always been emphasised by the British government that their tests were different. They were air bursts. The bombs at Christmas Island were apparently exploded high up to avoid fallout. The theory is when a bomb is exploded high in the air, it doesn't suck up so much material from the ground, and what fallout there is should be blown away into the upper atmosphere and dispersed.
Despite the Ministry of Defence's assurances that the tests were airbursts and therefore quite safe, our evidence suggests that this may not have been the case. And even if the airbursts themselves were safe, there were other circumstances in which servicemen could have been exposed to radiation and therefore contaminated. First, let's look at the sequence of the tests.
The tests were held off 2 small coral atolls in the Central Pacific. In 1957, 3 H-bombs were detonated 400 miles south of Christmas Island over a tiny atoll called Malden Island. In November that year, testing was moved to Christmas Island itself. An enormously powerful H-bomb was detonated just off the southeast tip of the island. In 1958, 5 more tests were held at the southeast of Christmas Island.
Of these later tests, 3 were H-bombs. 2, however, were small A-bombs, so-called low-yield weapons slung beneath balloons 1,500 feet above the ground and detonated by remote control. Now, these A-bombs were probably like those detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945.
All these tests were meant to be airbursts and therefore without dangerous radioactive fallout. But many witnesses of the first tests say they remember seeing large quantities of material sucked up by the blasts, as might happen if a blast were too low for safety. And others report that after an A-bomb test, it rained not far out at sea. Now, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, radiation had been brought down to the ground by rain. And certainly those who are at Christmas Island and have since suffered illnesses are convinced that there was contamination. Ken McKinley was one of the many Royal Engineers on the island.
Dead birds and fish were washed up onto the shore, and some were floating just off the port also. And we put these onto an LCM, and these were to be dumped out further at sea. I don't know how they were disposed of, but we just collected them and threw them onto the LCM.
Ken McKinley has had recurring skin and eye trouble ever since the tests.
Well, in addition, it's now become evident to Nationwide that all may not have gone to plan with one of the later tests, the one that took place on November the 8th, 1957. Because of the Official Secrets Act, people who were involved are reluctant to come forward. But we have heard from more than one source that all was not well on that November day. Clive Atkins was the bomb line direction operator on that test.
we were all sitting on the ground near our stations, and we were informed we had to be dressed in our long shirts and our long trousers with our sunglasses, and we were to sit there with our back to the bomb and told to cover our eyes with our hands, which we all did. When the bomb went off, the flash dried our clothing out because it was full of perspiration, and I actually could see the bones of my hands over my eyes through the flash. It was so brilliant. Then we had the sound of the bomb going off, and then after that we'd all turned round, all started to turn round, and we saw the blast hit the palm trees and bend them over. We were informed by the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment that the bomb had actually been dropped slightly lower than was anticipated, and that it was far bigger than they imagined.
Clive Atkins suffered mysterious paralysis shortly after the explosion and was later discharged from the RAF for medical reasons.
Apart from the safety of the tests, there's another major question. How safe was the handling of contaminated equipment? In order to analyse the content of the mushroom clouds after the tests, a Canberra bomber was sent up to fly through the cloud.
Well, before the aircraft were, Canberra bombers that is, were flown through the mushroom cloud, they were painted with wax base barrier paint, which was supposed to collect the radiation as opposed to the aircraft itself becoming radioactive. And then when they landed and they came to us for decontamination, the wax barrier paint was washed off with steam generators and hoses, radiation off with it, hopefully. There were occasions when some of us got a bit wet. There would have been times when I carried cans of kerosene and other mixtures that we got for decontaminating, and under the wing of an aircraft as somebody let loose water from above, and the clothing I wore wasn't the normal waterproof stuff. I had a cotton type of overall from neck to feet, and cotton hat as well. So of course water would have gone straight through it, and the radioactivity with it.
At the time, Bryan Young suffered terrible sores, and he's had a catalogue of illness since then. After the tests, the contaminated aeroplane and monitoring instruments had to be disposed of. This was a highly dangerous operation, and again, because of the Official Secrets Act, like so much about the Christmas Island tests, few details are available. However, people have reported to us that they remember the haphazard way in which some contaminated material was disposed of. They tell us of leaky containers and of material which they only found out to be contaminated after they'd dealt with it. We also have direct evidence that one ministry, at least in Whitehall, accepts that contamination did occur, and that a serviceman was harmed by his part in the clearing up operation in 1959. He was Warrant Officer Howard Stevens. His widow is Marjorie Stevens.
My husband died in January of 1980, and I then decided to pursue the causes of his illness. He died of leukemia. At the back of my mind was the fact he had served on Christmas Island in the Pacific shortly after the atomic tests had been made, and as a result the hazards of radiation, and the end product being, one of the end products being leukemia, which he died of. I applied to the DHSS for a war widow's pension on the basis of this, and this was rejected. But I was told I could take my case to a tribunal, which I did, and much to my surprise, they found the case in my favour, and I was awarded a DHSS war widow's pension. My opinion is that the Ministry of Defence deny any link with the illness and the atomic tests on Christmas Island. Whereas the Department of Health and Social Security obviously do agree, otherwise I wouldn't have been awarded the pension.
And indeed, the Ministry of Defence has refused to pay Mrs. Stevens the extra pension it awards to war widows. Mrs. Stevens told us that her concern in the end was not financial compensation, but that the truth of her husband's death should be recognised. Well, we have received more than 100 letters in the past few weeks. The information they contain has been sent in complete confidence for expert analysis, and the results are startling.
Well, Dr. Stewart, you've been concentrating on 80 cases which we sent to you of men who were under 25 at the time of the tests. What conclusions have you come to?
Well, there have been several reports of skin troubles and also of cataracts developing at a relatively early age. Those are the principal things, but there have also, rather surprisingly, been reports from relatives of people who have died and stating with some precision the cause of death and various other details which have been followed up. And it's in that corner of the data that one can test whether something has gone wrong.
And would you say there has? What has been the main cause of those deaths?
Well, they've only, of the people who've reported to us, there only have been 17, in this age group we're talking of, there have only been 17 deaths, but 16 of them were cancer, and the surprising thing is that 12 of the 16 were cancers of blood-forming tissues. That's either leukemia or lymphoma.
And would you say that that was an abnormally high incidence?
Well, I worked out very carefully what the expected number would be, assuming that there were 60,000 of these young men at risk. And the figure is almost exactly 10 for the whole period. So 12 observed, 10 expected. But if you turn to recent deaths, which are the ones most likely to be reported in such a study, deaths between 1976 and 82, then you find that the expected figure is only 8, and already 8 authenticated cases have been reported to nationwide.
And you would say that is an abnormally high incidence?
Well, it is, you see. 8 is twice as big as 4.
And Doctor, what is the connection between what you were mentioning earlier, skin rashes, cataracts, and leukemia and blood cancers?
Well, all 3 conditions are known to be a consequence of radiation.
Are your findings sufficient to lead you to believe that you have in your possession, with these cases that we've sent you, a rather unusual group of people, a group of people who might have had an abnormal experience?
Well, it would be, it's very surprising to me that so many deaths were reported in such a very small sample of cases. There were, in fact, only about between 80 and 90 reports in this age group. And therefore, I do think it does call for an investigation on the grounds that there's some very suspicious findings here.
Dr. Stewart, thank you very much indeed.
Professor Rotblat, you've been studying the effects of nuclear explosions since the very first one in 1945 at Los Alamos in America, and you've written a book about it all. You've heard those statistics and the comments on them. Can I ask you, do you believe that there must have been at least some contamination by radiation to have caused those sort of figures?
Yes, I do believe there are several ways in which people in the vicinity of a test explosion may be exposed to radiation. They may be exposed. It doesn't necessarily follow that all these events will take place, but there's a probability that they have taken place. I think the most important one probably is, following your film, which you explained the difference between air bursts and surface bursts. Generally, it is assumed that there's no local fallout at all if the explosion takes place at a high altitude. Well, this is not quite true, because there are possibilities of some local fallout occurring even with high altitude bursts.
Well, we suggested various ways that contamination could have occurred. First, there was the man who reported that water and ground material were sucked up in the blast. He thought he saw it going up. And in the first test at Northern Ireland, would that have been possible?
Yes, this is one of the possible effects, which is called the afterwind effect.
Where you have a big air...
You have got a column of water coming up from the sea, sucked up by the updraft, the very rapid updraft. Well, this means that some of that piece of the water from the sea will reach the fireball, mixed with radioactive materials, and under suitable atmospheric conditions, they may form droplets of water and come back down.
So it comes back down as rain.
As a radioactivity.
Although, in fact, the only rain that was reported was, I think, out at sea, and that would disperse fairly quickly?
Well, the rain is a different possibility. And this is what is called rain out, which means if the fireball, as it ascends, encounters a rain cloud, and then, of course, they get again mixed up, And in this case, afterwards, the waters come down with the rain, with radioactivity.
Would that have caused the dead fish that some people saw reported?
I doubt it very much, because that fish might have been caused by the blast which occurred there.
But finally, Professor Rutbeck, there was the talk of an explosion that might have been too big or too low. That could have caused a lot of extra contamination?
Well, if it were true, if the explosion occurred at a lower altitude, and of course it was bigger, then of course the effect might have been much bigger.
Professor Rutbeck, thank you very much for joining us. Sue?
I would just like to add that when I spoke to Dr. Alice Stewart earlier this afternoon, she did say that if anyone who was present at Christmas Island was worried about their health in any way, they should of course go to their doctor and if necessary ask him to do a blood count. And now we turn to the story of one man's courage